Russia has two gateways to the west. One is on fire, the other is boxed in. Right now, Russia is managing two separate logistics crises on opposite ends of its western border, and most coverage is only tracking one of them. In the south, Ukraine has spent this year systematically hitting every bridge, rail line, and fuel depot connecting Crimea to the Russian mainland. In the north, Russia's only Baltic naval base sits in an exclave, now nearly surrounded by NATO territory, since Sweden joined the alliance in 2024. One front is loud and visible, the other is quiet and structural. Together, they raise a real question. Is this the start of a genuine logistic squeeze on Russia's western flank? Or is each front more manageable than it looks from the headlines? If you want clear geopolitical analysis without sensationalism, subscribe and turn on notifications. Think of a country as a body and its supply routes as arteries. Cut one artery and the body can often compensate, rerouting blood through smaller vessels, straining but surviving. Cut two arteries on opposite sides of the body at the same time, and the compensation gets a great deal harder. Right now, Russia is dealing with exactly that kind of two-sided pressure on its Western logistics, in two theaters that rarely get discussed together. The Kerch Strait in the south, where the Crimean Bridge sits under sustained attack, and the Baltic Sea in the north, where Russia's only Baltic naval base sits in an exclave that has quietly become almost surrounded by a military alliance it spent decades trying to keep at arm's length. Let's start in the south, because the Crimean Bridge story has been building for years, and 2026 has been its most intense chapter yet. The bridge itself is a 19-kilometer road and rail crossing over the Kerch Strait, connecting Russia's Krasnodar region directly to occupied Crimea. It opened in 2018, and it has been a target of Ukrainian strikes going back to a truck bomb in October 2022 and a naval drone attack in July 2023, both of which caused real structural damage that Russia spent months and, by some estimates, hundreds of millions of dollars repairing. In June 2025, the bridge's underwater foundations were reportedly struck as well. But 2026 marked a shift in Ukrainian strategy. Rather than focusing purely on the bridge itself, Ukraine has spent this year running a much broader campaign aimed at every piece of transport infrastructure connecting occupied Crimea to the outside world. In June alone, Ukrainian strikes hit bridges over the North Crimean Canal near Preobrazhenka and Mairon, a road bridge on the Perekop-Armiansk route, and a bridge near the village of Stavki. The Chonhar Bridge, a major crossing linking Crimea to occupied parts of mainland Ukraine, was reportedly destroyed entirely after attacks in early June. Ukraine's Special Operations Forces separately destroyed a railway bridge over the North Crimean Canal near Rozdolne, a route Ukrainian officials described as a strategic military logistical artery used to move cargo and equipment from Russia through Crimea toward the southern front, a strike that collapsed one of the bridge's spans and knocked out the rail line entirely. Alongside the bridge strikes, Ukraine hit oil terminals, fuel depots, and port infrastructure directly around the Kerch Strait itself, including facilities on both the Crimean and Russian mainland sides, triggering fires, fuel shortages, and, according to Russian-installed officials, casualties among Crimean residents. Here's a simple way to understand why this matters beyond the symbolism of hitting a famous bridge. Crimea, as a peninsula, only has a small number of ways to move heavy military cargo in and out. Fundamentally, it's the Kerch Bridge itself, plus a handful of land routes crossing from occupied southern Ukraine. Think of it the way a delivery company thinks about a warehouse with only two loading docks. Close one dock and deliveries slow down, damage both, even partially and even temporarily, and the warehouse effectively stops functioning as a reliable supply hub, no matter how much inventory happens to be sitting inside it. This is precisely the logic behind Ukraine's approach. Rather than trying to permanently destroy the Kerch Bridge itself, an enormous structure that Russia has already proven willing and able to repair after previous attacks, Ukrainian forces have been targeting the entire logistics web around it. Alternative road bridges, rail lines, fuel storage, and port facilities that Russia would need if the main bridge were ever taken fully offline. One Ukrainian drone commander described the explicit goal in blunt terms: isolate Crimea and prevent Russian forces from operating freely on the peninsula and in nearby occupied territories. There is a genuine alternative overland route that gets raised whenever this topic comes up. The so-called Novorossiya Highway, running through occupied Mariupol, connecting Russia directly to occupied southern Ukraine without needing to cross the Kerch Strait at all. And it's true that this route exists and that Russia has used it to move military cargo. But it comes with real limitations of its own. It runs directly through active or recently active frontline territory, meaning it is far more exposed to Ukrainian strikes than a crossing well behind Russian lines would be. And moving heavy military equipment along a single overland corridor through contested territory is a fundamentally less secure proposition than moving it over a fixed, heavily defended bridge deep inside what Russia considers safely held territory. It's a genuine backup option, not a seamless substitute. So where does that leave the bridge itself? As of mid-2026, by most independent tracking, the Crimean Bridge remains structurally standing and operational, albeit at reduced capacity with speed restrictions, and Russia has invested heavily in both repairs and additional defensive measures, smoke generators, air defense systems, and traffic restrictions to protect it from further attacks. Traffic across the bridge has been repeatedly and briefly halted during major strike waves, in some cases for more than 5 hours at a stretch before reopening. That's a useful distinction to hold on to. The bridge has not been destroyed, but the broader network of alternative routes and supporting infrastructure around it has been degraded significantly and repeatedly throughout this year, which is arguably the more important strategic fact than the headline-grabbing question of whether the bridge itself is still standing. Now let's go north to a very different kind of choke point, one that's less about drone strikes and more about geography, reshaping itself around a single Russian outpost. Kaliningrad is a Russian region wedged between Poland and Lithuania on the Baltic coast, roughly 360 kilometers from the Russian mainland and physically disconnected from it by land. It's what's technically called a semi-exclave, and it happens to be one of Russia's most heavily militarized pieces of territory. Home to the headquarters of Russia's Baltic Fleet, Russia's only ice-free port on the Baltic Sea, and a permanent deployment of Iskander-M missile systems capable of carrying nuclear warheads, alongside advanced anti-ship missile systems and MiG-31 aircraft equipped to carry Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. For years, Russia's connection to Kaliningrad from the mainland has depended on a narrow strip of land called the Suwalki Gap, roughly 65 kilometers of Polish-Lithuanian border territory sitting between Kaliningrad on one side and Belarus, Russia's close ally, on the other. It's the only land route connecting the Baltic NATO members, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, to the rest of the alliance, which is exactly why it's been called, by more than one analyst over the years, the most dangerous 65 kilometers on Earth. Here's what's changed the picture dramatically in just the past few years. Finland joined NATO in April 2023, and Sweden followed in March 2024. Between them, those two accessions mean the Baltic Sea is now almost entirely ringed by NATO territory, from Norway's North Cape all the way around to Germany, with Kaliningrad sitting as essentially an isolated Russian pocket inside what amounts to a NATO-controlled body of water. Some analysts have started calling it, only half-jokingly, a NATO lake. Russia's own overland routes to resupply Kaliningrad now depend on transit through Lithuania or through Latvia or Belarus, while sea routes across the Gulf of Finland and Baltic Sea stretch nearly 900 kilometers, and air routes must now avoid NATO airspace entirely. Think about the position of a Russian logistics officer trying to plan a routine resupply convoy to Kaliningrad right now. Every land route runs through or immediately alongside NATO member territory. Every sea route travels through waters now patrolled by a far larger and more integrated set of NATO navies than existed just 3 years ago. That's a genuinely different strategic environment than the one Russia was operating in even a few years ago, and it's one that turns what used to be considered a forward military asset into something that starts to look, at least on paper, more like a strategic liability. But And this is the part that should complicate any tidy NATO lake means Russia is trapped narrative. Being surrounded on a map is not the same thing as being neutralized in practice, and the region has seen a genuinely active campaign of low-level hybrid activity that suggests Russia isn't simply accepting encirclement quietly. Since 2023, undersea cables in the Baltic have been repeatedly cut or damaged, including incidents involving so-called shadow fleet tankers dragging anchors across seabed infrastructure. GPS jamming and spoofing incidents in the region have surged dramatically, with European aviation regulators documenting an 80% increase in GPS outages between 2021 and 2024 alone, some of it traced with reported precision to specific installations inside Kaliningrad itself. 14 European coastal states issued a joint warning in January 2026 that Russian interference had placed vessels across the entire Baltic Sea at risk. An unusually blunt acknowledgement that satellite-based maritime navigation across an entire sea had effectively been compromised by a single actor's activity. And here's a data point worth sitting with, because it cuts directly against the comforting version of the NATO lake story. Earlier this year, a wargaming exercise organized by a major German newspaper and a university wargaming center simulated a scenario set in the Suwalki Gap following a hypothetical collapse of the Ukraine ceasefire. In that simulation, Russia used a combination of energy incentives toward Germany, troop buildups in Kaliningrad and Belarus, a fabricated humanitarian crisis narrative around transit restrictions and drone-laid mines along the border, and captured a critical road junction linking Poland to the Baltic states within 3 days, using a comparatively modest force of around 15,000 troops, while the simulated German government chose sanctions and consultation over a military response, and Article 5 was never even formally invoked. That's not a confirmed prediction of what would actually happen in a real crisis. War games are structured exercises, not forecasts. But it's a serious institutional signal that the surrounding by NATO territory framing doesn't automatically translate into an unbreakable seal around the Suwalki corridor in practice. In response to exactly this kind of concern, Poland has been building out something called the East Shield program, a roughly $2.5 billion network of fortifications, bunkers, surveillance systems, and minefields running 700 kilometers along its borders with Kaliningrad and Belarus, with Germany deploying engineering units this year to support the construction. NATO has also restructured elements of its Northern Command architecture following Finland's rapid military integration, and multinational battle groups in the Baltic states have grown in size and capability. So this is very much an active, ongoing arms and infrastructure race on both sides of that narrow strip of land. Not a settled question either way. So, pulling the two theaters together, does this actually amount to a two-front logistics war for Russia in the sense the framing implies? The honest answer sits somewhere between the dramatic version and the dismissive version. In the south, Russia is dealing with a genuinely sustained, materially damaging campaign against its Crimean logistics network, one that has repeatedly disrupted fuel supplies, damaged alternative routes, and forced Russia into costly, repeated repair and defense spending, even if the main bridge itself remains standing. In the north, Russia faces a structurally more difficult long-term geographic position around Kaliningrad than it did just a few years ago, but one it has so far managed through hybrid tactics, sabotage, jamming, a shadow fleet, rather than a position that has actually collapsed its ability to project force or resupply the Exclave. What ties both fronts together is less a shared crisis and more a shared exposure. Russia's westward military posture depends on two narrow, geographically constrained points of connection, a physical bridge in the south and a physical land corridor in the north, and both of those constrained points are now under sustained pressure from opposing sides, even if neither has yet been decisively closed. So here's where to watch closely over the coming months. In the south, watch whether Ukraine's strikes manage to meaningfully degrade the Mariupol overland alternative route as thoroughly as they've degraded the secondary bridges around Crimea, since that would be the moment the Kerch Bridge itself becomes Russia's only reliable option, rather than merely its primary one. In the north, watch whether the hybrid campaign around Kaliningrad escalates from sabotage and jamming into something that actually restricts Russian naval movement in and out of the Baltic Fleet's home port, since that would mark a genuine shift from a geographic disadvantage on paper into an operational one in practice. So here's the question we're sitting with. If a country's access to two of its most important Western military assets both depend on single, narrow physical corridors, a bridge in one case, a strip of land barely 65 kilometers wide in the other, how much of Russia's long-term strategic position in this war actually comes down to defending exactly those two choke points, rather than anything happening on the front lines themselves? Let us know what you think Moscow does first if pressure on both fronts keeps building at the same time.